Hi everyone, it's me. Today's lesson is on the who's who. We're going to talk about Darwin a little bit. We're going to talk about individuals who kind of influenced Darwin, people who came before him in terms of like early biological thought or early scientists, the kind of the background to a lot of the ideas that Darwin and Wallace ended up having. So we're going to get into that. Actually, so you'll notice this in the PowerPoints and then even in the Canvas core shell that a lot of the images that I try to use are pictures of Darwin when he's younger. I think a lot of times we have this image of him in our minds as this older man, like Santa, with the beard. But I mean, he was young when he was coming up with all of these ideas. There's this really good movie. Ooh, I want to say it came out in like 2009, 2010, 2009, I think. I'm usually pretty good at remembering movie dates, but it was a while ago, and it's called Creation, and it stars the actor Paul Bettany as like young Darwin, and I'm assuming most of you are pretty young. Paul Bettany is the actor who plays Vision, so he's been an actor for a long time. Yeah, so that could be a movie that you could watch for like extra credit. But that's a really good movie because it goes into like his married life and his children and like the difficulties that he had with his own health and his early research and how he was inspired by, one, of course, like the very famous, voyage of the Beagle, where he was, had this opportunity to go, but also his family life, the other, professionals and scientists who he worked with, So, I mean, that kind of goes with the other thing, the whole voyage on the Beagle. That's, the famous story of how he was able to get this opportunity. So essentially, Darwin was, when he was younger, he thought he'd be like some kind of religious leader. He went to seminary and, I mean, long story short, basically realized that, wasn't really for him. And his grandfather had been a naturalist, so like basically like a biologist or scientist. And so he was like, maybe that's what I'm gonna do. And so he got this really great opportunity to basically go on this voyage where, I mean, other things were kind of occurring, but his job on this voyage was to collect information and samples of like animals and bugs and birds, basically documented pictures, drawings, actual samples, and to collect information about these different areas of the world. And so like this is what he did. And so like as the story goes, he was inspired and a lot of it was really thought-provoking for him to see these different parts of the world and the different environments and the different animals that lived on in these areas. Famously, one of these areas being the Galapagos Islands. And realizing that life forms have similarities across different landscapes, but they often will be very, have very specific traits depending on those environments. And so this is, of course, he wasn't the first one to notice this, but he and Wallace were definitely the first to be able to articulate exactly what they were seeing and how very likely, and they were correct, how this process had like happened over time. So of course, he wasn't the first one to think of the world's probably a little bit older than we realize. Certain animals probably have had changes, and the ones that we have now might have looked different in the past, or like some general idea of change over time, but none of them really got the mechanisms correct. And Darwin and Wallace were the first to say, look, here's at least one of those mechanisms, natural selection. So you'll see, like I said, if you're following along with the PowerPoint, you don't have to, you can follow along, you cannot. It's really up to you how you want to do that. And I won't necessarily go bullet point to bullet point, but the general idea of the PowerPoint I'm going to cover, right? So some of the, let me see, I already said that. Oh yeah, actually to kind of mention Wallace again. So we always remember Darwin, right? When we think of evolution, specifically natural selection, we think of Charles Darwin. That's, what comes to our mind as like the person who, came up with this idea. But in reality, Wallace, Alfred Russel Wallace, actually another, scientist at the time, they had the same idea. In fact, I think the movie goes into this a little bit, but the story kind of goes, they are communicating with each other. And Darwin actually had been, this is really part of his whole original manuscript on the origin of species, a lot of that was inspired by his discussions with other scientists and their expertise on these things that he wasn't sure what he was seeing. And it was like he was able to kind of accumulate all of that knowledge and explain it. But so he had been thinking about this for a long time, these ideas, and he had been in communication with Wallace, and Wallace is like, I too have an idea. Why don't we like swap ideas? I'll send you my manuscript, you send me yours, and we'll kind of see maybe if we have the same idea or if we can help each other, etc. As good scientists will do, collaboration and whatnot, networking. So they do this, and the story goes that Darwin's manuscript is quite large, and Wallace's basically had the same explanation but was very short. And this is the thing too, if you are interested in reading on the origin of species, like, I totally encourage that. I've read it. I was when I was doing my undergrad, I read it. It is very easy to understand. It is I would say it's a little, I'll say it's very detailed. And what I mean by that is Darwin very clearly explains his ideas the same way, Wallace would have. But Darwin just gives you example after example after example after example after example. So in that, scientifically, it's an amazing manuscript because it's not just one thing he noticed. It's just like backed up by all of these observations, and so in that it's good. But if you, as the reader, you're like, it's kind of a lot. So it's if you read it, go into it with that knowledge, but it's like a classic manuscript, a classic book. It's one of the most well known in the world, and so he's spending all this time writing this, and so basically he and Wallace were like, look, we agree. So we need to present this formally to other scientists that we know. Let's get this out. Let's let them know our ideas. The process now is a bit different. If you were a scientist, you would, have to write a paper. It's peer review. Like, the whole process is a bit different, right? Which we've talked about. But so they basically went to what was it, like the Royal Linnean Society, and what was the date? 1858, that's right, 1858. And they are explaining their ideas in detail of like this process of natural selection. And right now, if you're thinking, okay, you keep saying that term, but what is it? We're going to get to that. But so they explain their ideas, and everyone else, in this room essentially is like, this actually sounds like very interesting, and it wasn't something that was completely new. Other people before them had had ideas about change through time, and just no one had really quite gotten it right. And so now they have this explanation that seems to really fit. And there were individuals who, let's say, not opponents of the idea, but definitely were like, look, this sounds like a great idea, and this thing is explained, and this other thing is explained, but like, what about this thing? And the big thing that they were kind of asking the question about was heritability. So little did they know that Gregor Mendel, right around the same time, is actually doing all of his famous work with the pea plants and understanding of like the father of modern genetics, essentially, how, like, what are the rules for how things are passed down, how they're passed down, how it works, And so Darwin and Wallace were like, we're pretty sure this is how it works. And they explained there's probably like rules to how things are passed down. And I think Darwin, instead of calling them genes, I think he called them like germules, but he was right about how it all worked. And then later, of course, we have Mendel's work, and it confirmed everything that Darwin and Wallace were saying. And so, but that was really the only question. Any of the controversy that we think of evolution having now is not really, well, say not quite how it was back then. Amongst the scientists, the controversy was just, okay, can you really truly fully explain this? It seems like you can mostly, but like, let's just kind of see how this plays out. But you can imagine culturally, kind of, I mean, unfortunately, very unfortunately, kind of similarly, now the cultural narrative of like biological sciences is, what's the word I'm thinking of? Just not understood or accepted. It's very strange, right? Because a lot of modern, let's say, people in like the US or Vegas or the US, let's say, don't typically have we'll say, a lot of modern science is completely and totally accepted. It's just like second nature, right? but a lot of it too is not. And it's just very strange, especially from people who don't necessarily understand the scientific process, like not even just the scientific method, which is part of the entire process, but everything else about it and how the whole thing works, even the terminology we use, people get confused about, so it's kind of understandable to a certain extent that there would be maybe a little bit of confusion. But I mean, this is a whole other topic, right? The state of our education system in the US and how a lot of these ideas, like I'm teaching this class at the college level, but I mean, typically we start to introduce these ideas in like high school, like biology and how things, change over time. It's not anything super complicated. It's not a controversial thing in itself at all, but for whatever reason, and I mean, we know why. Um, like our current culture, the history of our country, um, you know, religious impact, etc., culturally through time, all of those kind of background factors as to why this particular part of science has seems to be like problematic for people. I'm trying to explain this without um you know what I mean. You know, so I wouldn't say it's like a uniquely American thing, but it might be a little bit. I mean, really, most of the other, like even if we're talking about like the Western world, most of that there's really no issue with like the process of evolution, Darwin's ideas. It's just like, oh yeah, that's just another scientist. Here's another explanation of all the fields of science that we have. There are many. Here's another one of these, historical figures. But for whatever reason in the US, there's just this weird, not for everyone, of course, but this interesting split on it. Um, it is interesting. There's actually the documentary. Um, oh God, I'm blanking. Actually we're gonna watch. You guys are gonna watch for this in this class, called Judgment Day: Intelligent Design on Trial, and it talks about this court case that happened back in like 2004 or something. And it's this really great documentary. I show it every semester, usually to multiple courses. I've seen this documentary probably like at least 50 times. I still love it every time I watch it. It's very good. But it kind of like it goes into this court case. I'm not going to get too much into it. I could talk about it for a whole hour. We're going to watch it later. But one of the things they kind of go into is like the culture of the US and certain kind of areas of the US and how a lot of modern science isn't accepted. And, they kind of touch on that a little bit. But I mean, this should really be no surprise, to you. But it's a thing. And for the rest of us who are like, well, I mean, science is science. It's just, it's fact, it's objective. It's the whole point, right? It just seems kind of strange. Anyway, that was kind of a tangent, but I very likely will talk about some of that again later. So, but at the time when he's coming up with this idea, so there definitely was some pushback from like the larger cultural, the larger community. But it definitely was, I think, initially with some of the other people who really mattered in terms of like the actual like dissemination of the information, the other scientists. The main kind of issue was, how do you explain the heritability part? And then, like I said, it wasn't until a few decades later that this was all kind of put together, but then they realized, oh, Mendel was doing this research and this explains everything else. Darwin and Wallace were totally correct. And think about this also at the time this happened. This was like almost 200 years ago. We're discovering things now, and we have all these, technologies available to us, and we're still doing new things and discovering new things. Imagine a time when the resources available to you were so minimal, but these great ideas that we were able to figure out, these natural processes we were able to kind of pinpoint. It's all very interesting. History of science is always really cool. Let's see. So, I mean, what was his idea, right? What was Darwin's idea? So this very famous idea was natural selection. So whenever you hear people use the term, I mean, if they're using it correctly, because people use it incorrectly all the time, but if you hear the term Darwinian evolution, that is a specific reference to natural selection, because there are more, like, of the forces of evolution, there are 5. natural selection is only one of those ways. When we think about evolution, a lot of people, that's the first one that comes to mind, not necessarily like mutation or genetic drift, natural selection, but do remember that it is only one of the five. So this was specifically, Darwin's big idea. And so along with this idea, he's like, look, this is the process I think is happening. Kind of built into this process, there are these like assumptions kind of built into how the world or nature works. And so a few of these were that resources are finite, like, right, whether it's, food or water, whatever it is, there isn't an infinite amount on this planet. So if you are a predator, if you're the prey, whatever you're eating, whatever you need as a resource is going to be a limited amount. Some areas might be more abundant than others, but the idea that resources are finite, is something that exists, right? And because of that, there will always be competition. Now, competition might be lower or higher in amongst a certain species or another, depending on that environment, and et cetera, et cetera. We understand there's like fluctuations to that, but the simple idea that resources are finite, and because of that, competition exists, is kind of at the heart of a lot of Darwin and Wallace's ideas. And actually, that movie about Darwin kind of touches on this, because there's this one scene. I mean, it's been over a decade since I've seen this movie, but I remember, if I'm remembering it correctly, there was this one scene where Darwin and his like young daughter are like sitting out, like having a picnic, or I don't know, something like that. And in the distance, they see like a bunny, and they're like, oh, look at the bunny, and suddenly a fox comes along and, eats or grabs the bunny. And the young girl, she's, I don't know, like 10 or something. She's, of course, upset. And Darwin is like, look, it's sad. Yes, of course. But that fox also has babies too, like, so he's kind of explaining to her how life kind of works and stuff. And this really goes into this idea at the time, very prevalent around this time, and definitely earlier. And if you kind of go into like the history of like the philosophy of science and these early thinkers, about like John Locke, etc., you are going to find, well, I mean, everyone had different ideas, but some of the ideas back then were like, everything in nature, like in its most like natural sense, is very like pure and in balance and peaceful. This idea of like even certain groups of humans who are more in tune with nature are more peaceful, and it's like, you can't really say that's not true, but this was definitely this idea that anything coming from nature is peaceful and harmonious. And Darwin, was one of a few people who was like, it's only kind of balanced because the competition is consistent, right? There's this expression, it's called running to stay in place. I don't know if you've heard that before, running to stay in place. So basically it's like, yeah, everything looks like it's at stasis because the competition is going back and forth, prey, predator, there's like the cycle. So everything seems to kind of be at balance, but it's not necessarily peaceful in that way, right? And so Darwin was like, look, competition exists for these resources. And the other idea kind of built into this, his idea of like one of the assumptions was that variation also exists. So variation of traits. So whether you're an animal or a plant, a variation of every single little thing, how fast you are, your fur color, do you move about, do you fly, do you move about on four limbs, two limbs, every single, like even just looking at just humans, we could say eye color, hair color, nose shape, chin shape, height, what, like everything, anything and everything essentially. So Darwin's like, variation exists. Not every human female looks exactly the same. Not every, male frog looks exactly the same. There's always going to be variation for physical traits or behaviors, right? And so because of all those three things, resources are finite, competition is going to exist because of that, and there's variability with all the traits that we all have as animals, that certain individuals, depending on the environment, of course, depending on what's going on in the environment, certain traits are going to be more or less, beneficial, or what we call adaptive, given that environment. So kind of the classic examples are like, if you are, let's say like a white bunny living in an area where there's a lot of snow, And versus if you're a black bunny living in an area where there's a lot of snow, who's going to do a little bit better in that? Who's going to be more likely to survive, thrive, and most likely reproduce? It's going to be the one who has the white fur. That's only just one trait too, right? My freaking hair. We're not even looking at all the other traits, but just looking at just that one trait, we would say, oh, of course, the one who's white is going to blend in better, so the predators aren't necessarily going to see it, at least not nearly as often as the one with the darker, fur. And that's going to allow them to survive, thrive, and reproduce, a lot better, even if it's just a little bit better than the others who have the darker fur. And so over time, you're going to see more and more white bunnies reproducing, passing down the white coloring. So you're going to see a population that, let's say, initially was maybe 50% black bunnies, 50% white bunnies. 3 or 4 generations later is going to be mostly white bunnies, right? Because they're the ones who are able to survive, thrive, and reproduce. So that's a very simple way of looking at it. That's looking at just like one environmental factor, one physical trait. But I mean, that's kind of, it's like the simplest explanation, for how this process works. Now it can get really complex when you're looking at all the environmental factors, all the different traits that we have as animals, different species living amongst each other. There's so much to it, right? But the kind of specific idea of how natural selection works is very, very simple to understand. So I mean, that's kind of it. We can give multiple examples, and in the lesson on the forces of evolution, I obviously go into it a lot more. But that's kind of the very simple idea. So this concept that it's controversial in some way is just it's very strange, right? You're like, of course, resources are finite. Of course, competition exists because of that. And we don't have to even think about variability. We see that when we look outside in the natural world, when we look at each other as humans, right? We see variety. And so, of course, certain traits are going to be, depending on the environment, are either going to work really well or not at all. Some might be neutral. That happens too, So that's basically the idea, that those individuals who have a trait that's a little more beneficial, depending on that particular environment, are going to do better. There's this movie that came out in the 90s. I was like a teenager, and I remember watching it. God, I haven't seen it since then. It might still hold up, but maybe not. I think it's on Netflix. But it's this movie called Waterworld. And maybe you've seen it. Maybe your mom or dad probably has. And so the premise of the movie is that the polar ice caps have melted, and the world is now basically fully covered in water. And there's so much to the movie, but the main character, it shows him at the very beginning, he has webbed toes. Now, in that environment where he's doing swimming, he has a boat, but he does swimming a lot to get his food. He's doing that every day, all the time, right? Then having webbed toes would be super beneficial, right? You'd probably be able to be a little faster than those who didn't have that, etc. So in that sense, because of that particular environment, the trait is beneficial or adaptive. But let's say you had webbed toes in, Vegas 2026. It's kind of more neutral, right? It's not really getting in the way of anything. It's not necessarily helpful either. It's just kind of it's just there. So traits can be neutral, they can be beneficial, they can be detrimental. It just depends on, the environment. So, that's kind of the idea of natural selection. And like I said, those who have those traits will be more likely to typically reproduce more. And so over time, you're just going to see that change through time. That's really it. It's not a very complicated idea, at all. There are other forces to evolution, right? That's just one of the ways evolution occurs, but in itself, it's very simple. So that's kind of the idea. So what were people thinking, before that? So I have a list of a few people I'll touch on. Let's see. We've got the first one, Linnaeus. So you may have heard this name before, but basically he is probably the first person to realize we needed kind of a standardization to how we name and classify nature, essentially. I've mentioned this before in one of the other one of the other lectures about standardization of terms is very important, right? As scientists, are we using the same terminology? Are we using the same systems, of terminology? Which is kind of vital to our understanding of working in a larger system together, right? So one of the big ones was by what we call binomial nomenclature, general classification. So we've all probably learned this in even maybe even like junior high. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, da da da, the whole thing. And like someone had to come up with that idea, right? Now, here's the other thing too. This is like really important. Take my glasses off because it's so important. My hair is driving me crazy today. Okay, this is very important. When we look at systems like the scientific systems, in this case, we're looking at like the naming system. It is very important to remember that this is a system that is created by us humans, right? We created the system. When we look at the natural world, because we love to do this, we love to put boxes around things, we love to organize. We're like, when I look out on everything that nature has, which is a lot, the system like we've created seems to be the best system so far that allows us to kind of organize it in a way that makes it make sense to us, right? But this is a human-made system. And we've refined it over the years, right? But it's still a human-made system, which means it's not without its flaws. And there's no way that a human-made system is really going to be able to capture all of nature with like certain rules, right? So we might say, here we've had these larger categories of like a kingdom or a phylum or a class. We get more specific. The criteria start to get a little more tricky. Like how are we defining what's a species, right? We'll get into that later. What's a genus? What are the criteria? We're refining it all the time. I mean, even within any field, like primatology, for example, you're going to find that things get renamed and reclassified all the time because we realize, oh, the connections we thought were there maybe, genetically are different than we thought. Here's a new subspecies, etc. So we're always kind of refining it, but the system itself is still like a flawed system, which is why we talk about like, let's say a mammal means you have all these traits, but there's always kind of interesting exceptions to the rule. It's not really an exception to the rule. It's a rule we created, like, so of course it's going to be flawed. Nature's just doing whatever nature's doing. It's not saying, oh, you have to be born into this exact box. Like, that's absurd, right? So always keep that in mind, that whatever animal and plant, whatever that we're talking about, and trying to say, oh, it belongs in this category. This is a category we thought up. We made it up. The system of kingdom, phylum, class, order, was it kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species? 7? I think that's right, 7 categories. We could have created a system that had 8 categories. We could have created a system that had 4 categories. You know what I mean? Like, we have decided this one kind of makes it work best, but it's still, sorry, it's still a human-made system. So keep that in mind with a lot of this when we think of like, oh, this thing doesn't fit into like, it's an exception in nature. It's not an exception in nature. It's an exception to the rule we made up. The rules we made up work pretty well. Like, it's a pretty good system, but it's still a human-made system, So anyway, that's just a very interesting thing to remember. So also one of the bullet points here says binomial nomenclature, which is kind of how we discuss scientific naming. So if I said, okay, who are we as a species? Like, what's the common term? We would say, oh, the common term is like humans, right? That's the common term. Scientific term, which most of you are probably aware of, is Homo sapiens, right? Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens is binomial nomenclature. It's the genus and the species. If I just said sapiens, you would know what I'm talking about. But typically when we reference the scientific name, so if you're reading, like a scientific journal article, it's almost always going to have like the scientific specific name, which is always the genus and the species. We don't list kingdom, phylum, class. We don't know the whole thing, but genus and species is like the scientific naming process. So Linnaeus was also the one to kind of come up with that. Let's see, next we've got Buffon de Comte. So he was another naturalist, and let's see, there's a few people who have some overlapping ideas. Like I mentioned, a lot of these thinkers before him were like, look, categories probably exist in nature. There are things that probably aren't here anymore that used to be here. The world might be a bit older than we think it. Like, those weren't just like one person had that idea, I'll put my glasses back on. So here we have Buffon, who was one of the first to really look at how we categorize things and looking at like types of animals and what he called like unity of type. And he was also one of the first to say the world is probably a lot older than we think it is. Because also remember like the religious influences of the time, probably thinking, oh, the earth is only, 8,000 years old, which of course we know is ridiculous. I mean, even back then they would have said, oh, it's probably like, 5 million years old. We know now it's like billions, right? So even they probably could not have fathomed at that time how old it would be. But yeah, he was one of the first to say, look, it's probably a lot older, because also they were seeing, like, it's not like people were finding fossils for forever. They just had different ways of explaining it. Like, what are they seeing? This animal looks like this other animal we know, but it does look a little different. So it wasn't like people in general were unaware of, like, that things probably existed in the past that don't exist now, or things maybe have changed. So they understood, like, that probably means, or like, how can we explain that within the framework of the earth is only a few thousand years old? And oftentimes there's answers involving, like, well, the creator, whatever you believe, probably created all these animals, and some of them he didn't like, or like there were all these other religiously influenced explanations for it. Let's see, who else do we have? Cuvier, the father of paleontology. So not not paleo, anthropology, paleontology. And let's see. Catastrophism. So this was the other thing too. The big thing about how, like, the biological processes work is that it also involves how the earth itself works. So we kind of tend to forget that part. So, like, the idea of there being, like, earthquakes, volcanoes, plate tectonics, all of that stuff, we understand that plays a role in the biology of nature and life, because if that's going to cause environments to change, get hotter or colder, shift and move, new mountain ranges are forming, new rivers are forming, animals who were once in one population together now are there's a river between them, there's a mountain between them, et cetera, et cetera. So how evolution is occurring, natural selection, is definitely influenced by the actual, like, earth and its processes too. He wasn't correct in everything. He also believed that this idea of, like, a hierarchy of animals, which is completely incorrect, right? Like, you, as a student watching this video, could say, I think humans are better than fish, or, well, I don't know, whatever. That could be your personal opinion. But in science, that's not how we evaluate things. We don't say this thing is better or worse. That's not a scientific endeavor. That's like your personal opinion, right? We're not evaluating whether something's better. How do you even define that, right? We're not asking questions of, like, value judgment, good, bad, better, worse, nothing like that. A hierarchy could be your personal opinion, sure, but that's not how we would look at things scientifically. So we're always looking at, the connectedness of life. How are we connected to other, primates, other mammals? How much long ago did that occur? So think of it more as like a tree with all these little branches and sub branches, not like a ladder of hierarchy. But so Cuvier definitely had that idea, like, there were, oh my God, that there were certain animals that were, like, better or more advanced, right? So, flawed idea, but I'm given the culture of the time, it's, like, not surprising. Let's see, who else? Oh, Lamarck, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. So Lamarck, sorry about this tickle in my throat. It's driving me crazy. So Lamarck almost got it right. He was like, look, Earth is probably a lot older than we think it is. Change through time has happened. It's probably based on something that is inherited from offspring, like from their parents, right? But he kind of got the way it worked wrong. And so this was something called inheritance through acquired characteristics. So this idea, very simply, this idea was that he thought that if an individual did something within their lifetime, like to their body, that trait could then be passed to their offspring. And we know, like, that's not how it works, right? Like, if you go to the gym and you get, like, really big, like, biceps, your children aren't going to be born with larger biceps because of that, right? That's not how it works. If you get a tattoo, your offspring is not going to be born, like, with that tattoo, right? The things we do to our body within our lifetime cannot be passed down to our offspring. So I think the example the book gives you is, like, for his idea was that he thought, well, the giraffes who they're reaching for these trees, these tall trees, to get the food off the trees. if they are stretching and stretching and stretching their neck to reach the tree, like the food on the top of the trees, then their offspring will be born with like slightly longer necks, allowing them a little easier time with getting the food. And if you didn't know anything about how genetics work, you might think, okay, maybe there's merit in that idea, right? But we know now it's completely flawed. Like what you do to your body in your own lifetime cannot be passed down. So there is an interesting kind of newer field called epigenetics. And so this looks at things where there can be outside influences to like your genetics. Like an obvious one is like radiation exposure can definitely change you genetically sometimes, reproductively sometimes. So there are ways that the outside world can influence like reproduction a little bit in these like rare circumstances, but that's not like Lamarck's idea. This was very specific to if I'm running faster, if I learn how to run faster, then my children will be born faster. Like that, we know that's not how it works, right? So he gets a lot of flack, like, oh, he was so stupid, he didn't understand it. But for the time, he was really close to understanding what was actually happening. Just didn't quite get it. So you got to give him, credit for that a little bit. Next, Charles Lyell wrote The Principles of Geology. So once again, looking at the geological aspects. And this is someone who definitely influenced, a lot of other people. But looking at, like I said, once again, the processes of the actual Earth itself and how that plays a massive role in extinction events, in evolution in general, Let's see. And then the last person is Thomas Malthus. So Thomas Malthus looked specifically at like humans for a lot of his research, and he influenced Darwin in that. So his ideas were talking about what we call carrying capacity, not caring, like not like, oh, I'm caring, but carrying capacity. So basically the idea that a certain, whatever area, region, island, country, whatever, can only support, in this case he was talking about humans, based on like the food that can be grown, etc., the animals that can be eaten. It can only support a certain number of people, and there's kind of a threshold. And once you kind of get beyond that threshold, like let's say you're like, you could say, okay, this region based on like all the resources can definitely sustain, 10,000 humans without a problem. So that's kind of like the carrying capacity. And if nothing changes, except if the population grows, suddenly you're like, okay, now is when we start to struggle to be able to like provide food for everyone, right? And there's like a bunch of factors in how this works. But this was his kind of main idea. And he talked about like populations and how, and at the time, this idea that the human population is growing, and it wouldn't be able to sustain, 100 million people. And now we're like 100 million. What about 8 billion, So, I mean, because obviously through time we come up with different strategies and techniques of feeding people, and good and bad, So, I mean, that's kind of a very current conversation, socially, about how we're doing all of that and how somehow people still aren't getting enough food. That's a whole other conversation. But so his ideas, though, influenced Darwin in that, okay, the finite ness of resources and competition existing because of that. So, Anyway, I talked a little longer than I wanted to, but we're still at 30-something minutes, so not bad. And you know me, I like to go on a little bit tangents here and there. So that's it for this one. I will see you guys on the next one.